Hi, this is Professor Makimura, and I'm going to record now the story of early modern India. So let's now share screen. Here we are, early modern India. And we're primarily going to talk about the Mughal Empire, but I'm going to also talk about the Kingdom of Mysore and the British East India Company. So this is early modern India. Here we go. So the Mughal Empire starts in 1526, and it's a coherent entity until 1707. In fact, you could make the argument that even though it starts in 1596, it only becomes a coherent entity starting in 1555 or so, and lasts until 1707. But that's still, 150 years of, stability. It's actually, nothing to scoff at. The empire technically lasts. The emperor continues to reign until 1857, but after 1707, and he basically loses control over the kingdom, or over India. So the Mughal Empire basically is ruling over this vast region. They have conquered almost all of India by 1700. And then after 1707, it basically just falls apart. So the early emperors are people like Babur, whose name literally means tiger, like Tiger Woods. Um, he's from Central Asia. He's a Central Asian warlord. Uh, he conquers from Central Asia and takes over the northwestern part of India. Um, and when he takes over the northwestern part of India, because he is a Turco-Mongol descent, he's part Mongol, part Turkish descent. Uh, they call themselves the Mongols. So Mughal is a corruption of the name Mongol. So they're not really Mongols because they're more Central Asian, although the Mongols are Central Asian, but you know what I mean. The Mongols are Mongols from north of China. That's like, that's Mongolia as far as I'm concerned. That's the heartland of the Mongols. But under the Mongol Empire, obviously they expanded, and conquered the world. So in Central Asia, you have these descendants of Mongols there. They intermarry with locals. One of the results was Babur, the tiger, who was, a Turco-Mongol. Just like how Tamerlane, the guy I talked briefly in the lecture on the early modern Middle East, was also a Turco-Mongol, part Turkish, part Mongol. Right. Anyway, so Babur takes over northwestern India, um, but his son Humayun, and after Babur dies, Humayun takes over. But his son Humayun uh, basically got challenged. His brothers challenged him for his father's inheritance, and the sons basically fought against each other. And finally, Humayun had to go into exile. He is in exile in Persia, and he's basically living with the Persians for a while until I don't know, after the people who have killed him, basically, who have exiled him, after the people who have exiled him have died, he sees an opportunity and decides to go back to India and take it back. And when he goes back to India, he brings with him a bunch of Persian mercenaries with him. Basically, what happened is that Babur's son Humayun asked the Persian emperor if he can borrow his army, and the Persian emperor's like, "Why? You can stay here as long as you want, but I'm not going to lend you my army." And then Humayun says, "But I've got this giant diamond. I'll give this to you if you lend your army." And so Humayun borrows, the Persian army, Persian mercenaries at this point now, and they go and Humayun reconquers the lost territory. Now he's only in India for like less than a year, like 8 months or something like that, and then he dies. After he dies, Akbar takes over. Akbar is the son of Humayun, and when Akbar takes over at a really young age, he's like like 15 or something. He's like in his like he's a teenager. Uh, he basically gets the help of his advisor, uh, and together they basically conquer almost all of North India. And after a good chunk of the conquest is done, Akbar banishes his his what do you call his advisor. Um, Not exactly surprising. He probably wanted to be his own man, so he got rid of him. He told him to go on a pilgrimage, and he went on a pilgrimage, but he gets assassinated on the way. I don't know if the assassination was done on the orders of Akbar or not. My guess is probably not, but I don't know for sure. I think nobody knows for sure. Anyway, Akbar is a very important emperor because he establishes universal tolerance, like tolerance as we understand the term in India, and this policy of tolerance is carried through under Jahangir and Shah Jahan, and then finally you get to Aurangzeb, who then overturns all of that. So if there are two emperors that you need to know, just like the two emperors you need to know for the Ottoman period, is Mehmet II and Suleiman I. The two emperors you need to know for the Mughal Empire are Akbar, this guy here, and Aurangzeb, this guy here. Okay, so here we go. So why are these guys, able to do this vast conquest? Just like the story of Humayun's shows, basically in the Mughal Empire, you have a variant of that fratricide that you see in the Ottoman Empire. So instead of assassinations or poisonings or stuff like that, in the Mughal Empire, what happens is the princes basically fight a short civil war to determine the successors. So the father might say, I want this person of my son to be the next emperor, because you got four wives and all these four wives are technically equal to each other. The kids just can't agree, and because they can't agree, they duke it out amongst themselves to see who will be the next leader. So by definition, then the victor is going to be competent at the very least. If you're incompetent, you would have lost in these short civil wars. So you get these competent emperors to govern, in a series of rules. So that actually helps. Uh, and just like in the case of the Ottomans, the Mughals also basically uh, don't give the right to own the land to the aristocrats. They give the right to the aristocrats to collect taxes, like timars. In the Mughal case, it's called jagirs, right? The jagirs can be transferred from location to location, and the aristocrats have to move around from one place to another. Now, these aristocrats, known as mansabdars, there's roughly about 2,000 aristocratic families in the Mughal Empire, at the height of the Mughal Empire. And of these mansabdars, we actually have some data around the time of Aurangzeb. No, sorry, Akbar. Um, so depending on the size of the aristocratic family, if it's like and by size of the, I mean like if it's a renowned aristocratic family, a powerful aristocratic family, they would lead like 5,000 troops. It's a lot of soldiers. There could be a small aristocratic family in which they would lead like 50 troops. So anywhere between 50 troops to 5,000 troops would be led, and princes would sometimes be leading 10,000 troops, and the grand aristocrats sometimes would also be leading like 10,000 troops as well. So they control huge jagirs, huge territorial land to raise taxes and raise their own private armies from them. But the point here is that you actually see a breakdown of who these guys are. So roughly 6% of this 2,000 families were Afghans from the original homeland of Babur. About 50% were Persian or Mughals. So I don't know what the ratio is, but some of them were obviously descendants of these Persian mercenaries that came with Humayun, and the others are also Mughals that came with Babur, right? But the Afghans are not Turco-Mongols. But the Mughals are the Mongols. So they came from Central Asia. Uh, some of them are like specifically Afghans. The others are from, claim descent from various Mongol tribes, and others claim descent from the Persian mercenaries. And then another 17% are Indian Muslims, right? So roughly speaking, right, about 80% of the population are Muslims. And then the Hindus are roughly 20%. So you actually have Hindu aristocrats in the Mughal Empire. And this is, the result of Akbar's, decree of universal tolerance. So Akbar didn't just have four wives; he had many wives, and among his many wives, most of them were Muslims. But he had one Christian, and he had, I think, two Rajputs. So these Rajputs are Hindus, right? Rajputs basically are Hindus who claim that they are ideal kshatriyas, ideal warriors. So he married these Rajput princesses, and when he married these Rajput princesses, their entire clan basically is now brought within the fold of the Mughal Empire, and they, instead of defending Hinduism against invading Islam, now are serving the Islamic Mughal Empire. Now, what allowed this to be, you know, doable was the fact that Akbar said, you know what, I'm not going to be like a stereotypical Muslim, and I'm not going to enforce Islamic law on non-Muslims, right? So if you are a Hindu, obviously non-Muslim, you do not have to pay the non-Muslim tax, right? That was the big one, right? Non-Muslim tax basically meant that if you're not Muslim, you have to pay this extra tax, and that is abolished. And Akbar basically makes the decree that all the people in his realm will be treated equally and fairly. And as a Indian ruler, it is now his duty to take care of the people like a father, right? So, although he is a Muslim conqueror, instead of harking back to Muslim traditions of governance, he actually uses the Indian tradition of governance more, and takes on universal tolerance. And this policy is carried on under Jahangir and Shah Jahan. So, the people of India, despite being like 80% Hindus and 20% Muslim, are okay with this, right? So that's why the Hindu Rajputs are able to ally with Aurangzeb. If they, if their princess had to convert to Islam to marry Akbar, I don't know if the Rajput leaders would have allowed that marriage to happen. But because Akbar said, your daughter can remain, Hindu. We're not going to change that. She can have her shrine, right? She can worship a Hindu god in my palace. She can have a section within my palace, and she could worship a Hindu god in there. That's fine. That probably allowed them to say, all right, maybe we can work with these guys. So that allows the Mughals to basically, conquer and conquer and conquer. So this is the Taj Mahal. Taj Mahal is made by Shah Jahan's wife. Shah Jahan was the grandson of Akbar, so Akbar Jahangir Shah Jahan, and Shah Jahan and Jahangir, they all ascend the throne in the same way, which is by either fighting a civil war against their brothers, or by imprisoning their father, or some such nonsense like that. So who is Aurangzeb? Right? I should have put up an image of Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb was a devout Muslim, so he really believed in Islam, right? And just for private faith, private religion, do what you will. But he won the civil war and became emperor. And once he became emperor, as a firm believer in Islam, not only he banned alcohol from his palace, he actually tried to not about he abolished the policy of tolerance and reimposed Islamic law on the Indian people. This specifically meant paying the non-Muslim tax. Hindus now had to pay the non-Muslim tax under Aurangzeb. Not only did Aurangzeb do that, because he was a firm believer in Islam, he went around destroying Hindu temples, and sometimes in the location of where a Hindu temple used to stand, he would build a Islamic mosque. So you're rubbing salt into the wound, right? And so obviously then the Hindu population is really angry at this. Now, the empire as a whole maintained coherency under Aurangzeb and continued to hum along, and that's because the overwhelming majority of the aristocrats were Muslims. So when Aurangzeb did this, the overwhelming aristocrats are like, oh great, I get to collect more taxes through the non-Muslim tax. Sure, we'll go with this. And they went along with this. Now the 20% Hindu aristocrats were obviously not happy with this, but they're a small minority. So even if they don't want to fight and participate in Aurangzeb's wars, if he's got 80% of the aristocrats on his side, then it's not going to be a problem. So what happens? Well, after Aurangzeb dies, like almost every human being has to die, and Aurangzeb dies in 1707, you get a civil war. This time around, this civil war is not a short civil war, it's not a small civil war. Because now the aristocrats of India know that whoever becomes the next emperor, they can change the policy. They can set the policy to be a policy of tolerance, or they can set the policy of implementing Islamic law. So many Hindu princes, Hindu aristocrats, will support one of Aurangzeb's sons who is going to be supportive of the policy of tolerance. And other aristocrats will be in support of Aurangzeb's son who is in support of keeping Islamic law. So the civil war among the personal armies of the princes to see who will be the next leader basically becomes a much bigger affair that engulfs a huge chunk of the Mughal Empire because various aristocrats are now have material interest in this. So that's a problem. And then after the civil war is over, Aurangzeb's successor is chosen and becomes a new emperor. Um, and then I believe a short 5 years or so after that new emperor dies of natural causes. And so you get another round of civil war to see who among the surviving princes will be the next emperor. So the American Civil War was a pretty bloody affair, but America came out of it okay. I mean, not okay is the wrong word, but America came out of it, and actually, America came out of it. You could make the argument stronger than ever, but if you're a Southerner, obviously you wouldn't think that way. But it was a wrenching experience for everybody. There's no question about that. Well, imagine fighting another civil war 5, 10 years right after that. I don't think the republic will hold if you have like civil war after civil war. And that's what happens to the Mughal Empire. After Aurangzeb's death, there is actually two emperors in short succession. And that basically meant that there was two civil wars to rip the empire apart. And after these two civil wars, the new emperors who come after Aurangzeb, basically, or after, Aurangzeb's son, uh, basically can't maintain control over the entire empire. The aristocrats around the country basically are no longer going to listen to the emperor. Even though the emperor has the right to basically, summon these aristocrats to his court to, determine things, people no longer obey the emperor. The jagirs that they were given basically become their private fiefdoms. And just like in the Ottoman case, the Mughal Empire also basically begins to, decentralize and become more feudal. But in this case, it's more severe, and the Ottoman Empire is able to maintain unity, but the Mughal Empire is unable to maintain unity and begins to fragment. Uh, like when the Nizam of Hyderabad declares independence, that's pretty bad. Hyderabad is this massive territory down here in the southern part of the Deccan, this part of India here. And the Nizam means prime minister. So when the prime minister of your own country says, "Yeah, you know what, I'm going to be independent and do my own thing," well, if that's the case, then I'm the governor of Bengal. What the hell? I'm going to do my own thing, right? Bengal being over here. And so people basically, break off, or you get local rebellions to overthrow Mughal rule. And the Mughal emperors can't get enough soldiers to go out and quash the rebellion. And so they become independent leaders. So, for example, the Marathas over here uh, overthrow Mughal rule and become independent. And the emperors in Delhi, that's their capital here. Babur comes, invades, and then by Akbar's time, I think by Akbar's time, yeah, Delhi becomes the capital of India, and the Mughal emperors can't do anything to like crush the rebellion, which is right down south over here. So that's how the Mughal Empire collapses, a succession of two civil wars. Almost no country can maintain a situation of unity in that situation. All right, so what happens afterwards? Well, despite the fact that the Mughal Empire has collapsed, there is a sense that India is one. Right? The Mughals were the third empire to pretty much unify almost all of India. And in the unification of India, they have created the sense that there is an entity called India. And this is carried over by the British because the British are also going to unify India. And so even after the British leave, there's a very strong sense that there is one entity called India, and Gandhi was a big believer in that. Now, this is like getting ahead of ourselves, but in the 20th century, you have people like Muhammad Jinnah who said, but if we become one India, as Gandhi and others proposed, then the Muslims of India would be a permanent minority. So we can't have one India. We have to actually break it up. And so that was the price for Indian independence. Right? British India basically becomes India and Pakistan. Pakistan is the homeland of the Muslim peoples of India. All right. So the Mughal Empire, lasts for 150 years. But in that 150 years of real coherence, they create that sense of India, or they restore that sense of India. Uh, a new language actually also emerges as well. The Mughals, in order to not favor any one particular group, instead of using a local Indian language as the court language, the Mughals use Persian as the court language of the Mughal Empire, which is amazing. Because Persian would be a foreign language for everybody, except for the Persian mercenaries. Um, and in that use of Persian, you get the emergence of what is called Urdu, a new language that people in Pakistan today speak. It's the primary language of Pakistan, if I'm not mistaken. So Urdu is a language that combines Hindi, it combines Persian, it combines elements of Arabic and Turkic. So a new language comes out of Mughal rule. Personal titles, official rank, place names, all these things remain, right? Uh, and a lot of these place names, a lot of these ranks and titles actually have Persian origins, which is very interesting. But instead of calling yourself the king, the Raja of Bengal, they call themselves, the governor of Bengal, right? So that title kind of remains. Or the king of Hyderabad, they call themselves the prime ministers of Hyderabad. That would be the Nizam of Hyderabad, stuff like that. The Mughals united the coins, weights, and measures, and various forms of taxes, and so these things become unified across a huge chunk of India as well, and continue to be used even after the collapse. Um, and under the Mughals, you get the emergence of what is called Jati, the caste in the modern sense. Um, and under the Mughals, you also get Sikhism. So Sikhism parallels kind of what Akbar was trying to do. Akbar was trying to create a universal religion at one point, although it never went anywhere. But you get this fellow named Guru Nanak who had created a new religion, and it is under the Mughals that it begins its first spreading. So Guru Nanak basically had meditated and came to enlightenment, and in his enlightenment, he realizes that we've been fighting between Muslims and Hindus, but that's wrong. It's the same, right? He has this like epiphany that there is only one God. Yes, it's true. There is only one God, but God you know, God is genderless in Sikhism. So I was going to say his, but the English forces me to use either his or her. But God in its magnificence, it sounds so wrong. Basically shows itself in many forms to people. So when the Hindus say that there are many gods out there, they're just seeing the different aspects of the one true God, right? So the one God is expressed as many gods, but there's only one God. And our goal in life is that the Hindus are right about this. We are reincarnating, but our goal in life is to reunify with God, right, which is truth. Uh, so that's Sikhism, and this new religion that merges all these things. These religious ideas emerges, and it comes out of that. Uh, uh, you know, it begins to flourish under Mughals. Although initially they are persecuted. Let me not make any bones about this. Initially, the Sikhs are persecuted, and being under persecution, they have a turn. I think initially they're almost pacifist, but being persecuted, they have to gain militancy, and the Sikhs eventually become militants. and they become armed. So to this day, Sikh men carry ceremonial daggers with them because all Sikh men are supposed to be warriors as well. All right. So now let me talk about jati, or the caste, as people generally tend to understand the term. So the Mughals were obviously Muslim conquerors, and as Muslim conquerors, they would be classified as warriors. And so they would never accept the old Varna system of India. The Varna system being the idea that the Brahmin priests are on top, and then number two would be the warriors, and number three would be commoners, and then finally slaves. Although by Mughal time, it would probably still be Brahmin priest, warrior, then merchant, and then agricultural labor, right? Something like that. But middle class people would be the third, Vaishya, and then the fourth would be Shudra, and they would be like not slaves, but they would be like poor people. Uh, the Mughals will never be convinced by this. So they would never accept a Hindu priest to be their superior, but they liked the idea that society was divided, because it allows them to you know, rule through divide and rule. So what eventually emerges is an occupational group. So this occupational group is determined by rank and determined by wealth and power. So if you are a Muslim ruler, you put yourself at the top, right? And then if you are dirt poor, whether you're a Muslim or Hindu, you're on the very bottom. And if you may be a Brahmin priest, but you only own a certain amount of land, not a huge amount of land, but you only own your own land, and you're just a you know you know you're just a village elder or something like that, then you're somewhere in the middle. Right? Or if you're a merchant, but you're a great merchant, like those merchants that do like long distance trade between Europe and India, in other words, the Christians, then you'd also probably like make it into the top ranks as well because you can hobnob with the Mughal elite, right? So if you have wealth or power, you're on the very tippy top. And if you don't have wealth and power, you're on the very bottom. And if you have somewhere in the middle, then you're somewhere in the middle. So jati is fundamentally a secular ordering of occupational groups in India, right? And each of these groups basically live together, they dress similarly. They eat the same food. They worship the same, and they worship in the same manner. And each person marries within their in group. So uh, you get this, essentially like the moment you're born, you're part of this union-like thing, and you can't leave it, and you're stuck there till you die. But because it's a union, right, where everybody is working together and living together and getting married with each other, that you can't leave. That means that in old age, your group takes care of you. So nobody becomes truly destitute in old age. Nobody's just left alone to die. So uh, it's a terrible system, but it's not like there's totally no reasons for not having it, right? The big reason why you might not have it is for social security reasons. That would be the reason why you would have the jati. Um, Now, when it first emerges, not first, but when the Mughals are taking over India, the jatis are still very fluid. And the occupational groups are not necessarily set in stone to see who's on top and who's on bottom. Although obviously the rulers are on top, but within the middling groups, there's like a huge, varied, fluid thingy that's happening for a while, and people could intermarry as well. But as time goes on, this becomes more and more ossified, right? So that's what's happening to India, and the Mughals sort of unwittingly, encourage this and set this system up. Well, the Mughals encourage this, and unwittingly, this has become a problem that basically lasts to the present day. The caste problem is a major issue to this day in India. Although technically speaking, castes have been abolished, it hasn't been fully. The effects of it has not been fully gone, and that's because it's got elements of the Varna system of old, and it's got elements of Jati system of the early modern period. So by combining the elements of the Varna system of old, you have the idea of ritual purity that's part of the caste system as we understand the term today. And by combining elements of jati, you get this caste system that's occupational that you can't leave as well. Um, this partly, by the way, explains why India has put a lot of effort into information technology, into computers and IT. And that's because there were no such things as computers and IT in the early modern past. So if you're ambitious, but you come from a low caste in India today, that you study and you want to join IT or the computer business because it's a completely new business, there's no jati associated with it. But if you want to be like a barber or a hairdresser or cook or a tailor or any like jobs that you can think of that has antecedents in the past, you get stuck in a jati, and so it's very hard for someone that's outsider to break in. And people were like been doing that for like generations now. So there's a reason why there's a lot of you know growth in the IT sector in India and the prominence of Indians in the IT sector, information technology center. All right, so that's the Mughals, right? Their rise, the collapse, and the impact on India, which is huge, right? So that's why they're important. All right. So here is now a map of India after the 7 Years' War. So the 7 Years' War happens from 1756 to 1763, and it's taking place roughly, 50 years after the death of Aurangzeb. Now, it's the 7 Years' War is primarily a European war, but it has impacts in India because the English East India Company and the French East India Company, well, maybe it's the British East India Company at this point, are duking it out in India. And when they're duking it out in India, they're basically getting all these, Indian kings, or also fighting wars against other Indian kings, and so the Indian wars are linking up with European wars. So this is actually a pretty good map to understand what's going on here. So down here is the Kingdom of Mysore. Here is the Nizam of Hyderabad. This area here is the area of the Marathas. They have, overthrown Mughal rule. The Rajputs no longer obey the Mughals as well, and they have overthrown. So the Mughals basically controlled, North India along the, you know, upper Indus to the Ganges River plain, right? But even this area that they control, Bengal, is ruled by the governor of Bengal, who's pretty much doing his own thing and is not really listening to the Mughal emperor. But technically speaking, the Mughal emperor has, at least in theory, command over all of this. Well, actually, minus the Rajputs, so command over all of this. Right? So that's the environment of India, right? The Mughal empire has collapsed. Bits and pieces have fallen off, become independent, and other pieces were originally, governors or prime ministers, servants of the Mughal Empire, but they're now pretty much doing their own thing. Okay, and it is in that environment that you get the British, who are in Madras, Bengal, and Bombay. I'm sorry, not Bengal, Calcutta, on the coast of Bengal, Bombay and Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay, and the French, who are in Pondicherry that I can't see, but it's near here. It's near Madras, right? The French are near here, and the French are like somewhere over here as well. But the French also have posts in India as well. All right, so there we go. Mysore, the British East India Company. 1721, right? Sorry, 1724. So 17 years after Aurangzeb's death, after two civil wars, the Nizam of Hyderabad in southern India declares independence from Mughal rule. And this independent Hyderabad now allies with the French East India Company to fight wars around them. So they get these French advisors and French help to fight wars. 5 years later, the 7 Years' War breaks out, and the British and the French are at war. In this war, Hyderabad is also, I think, initially on the French side, but then eventually stops being on the French side. And because Hyderabad is fighting wars against its neighbors, they have to worry about, the Mughals to the north and to the Marathas to the north of them as well. Plus, they have to worry about Mysore. Um, Anyway, the result of the 7 Years' War is that after winning against the French and after winning against the Mughals, who have allied with the French, the British East India Company gains the right to collect taxes in Bengal. And with the right to collect taxes in Bengal, the East India Company of Britain is on its path to becoming a government. So the EIC refers to the East India Company. So around the time of the 7 Years' War, you get Hyder Ali. Right? Hyder Ali was a army commander. He was Muslim, but he was an army commander working for a Hindu kingdom called the Kingdom of Mysore. Right? And through army commander, he eventually becomes a prime minister and essentially rules the kingdom. Right? And temporarily, Hyder Ali and the Nizam of Hyderabad allied to fight against the East India Company in the first Anglo-Mysore War, which is after the 7 Years' War is over. And in this one, Hyder Ali is actually winning, but I think Mysore, not Mysore, Hyderabad once again betrays. And they drop out of the war, and so nothing conclusive happens in this first Anglo-Mysore War. And then Hyder Ali gets involved in another war against the English in the second Anglo-Mysore War, and it's in the middle of the second Anglo-Mysore War that Hyder Ali dies, and you get Tipu to become the next leader. So Tipu, as the next leader, the son of Hyder Ali, decides to not just be the prime minister, but also to take over the throne himself, and he becomes known as Tipu Sultan, because he's now the king. And under Tipu Sultan, for 17 years, the kingdom of Mysore is actually going to put into place a series of reforms, because what they recognize is the changes that's going on in Europe and the need for reform. So this is one of the first real reform attempts that you see in an Asian country to try to, match what the Europeans are doing so that they don't get defeated by European powers. Um, and unfortunately for Mysore, Tipu Sultan basically tries to invade Travancore, which was an ally of the British, and this actually, gets him embroiled into the third Anglo-Mysore War, and in the third Anglo-Mysore War, half of Mysore essentially is lost. Right? Tipu Sultan loses to the English, to the East India Company, and half his land, half the kingdom of Mysore is handed over to his enemies. Uh, so why does this happen? Well, Tipu Sultan thought that he was going to be able to win an easy victory against Travancore, but no. He is attacked from all sides. Hyderabad and the East India Company go to war against Mysore, and so finally, he has to give up. All right. So there is going to be a fourth Anglo-Mysore War starting in 1798, and this is because Mysore and Hyderabad go to war, and in this war, the East India Company is backing Hyderabad. So Hyderabad initially starts off as being an enemy of the English East India Company, it's a friend of the French. But by the end of the 1800s, they had switched sides, and they're now fully, on board with the English side. And Mysore steadfastly remains an enemy of the English. And as one of its, things, they tried to ally with the French, and they have a nominal connection with the French. But by this point in time, the French have been kicked out of the India, and they can't really support the Indians. And not only that, in the war that they're fighting, in the uh, uh, in the wars that they're fighting, um, the French could have supported the Indians more, but instead, what they do is they support the Americans. So uh, you have the 1776 Declaration of Independence, and you get the American War of or the American Revolution from 1776 to 1783, and French resources are basically poured into North America, and they're completely neglected what's going on in India. But if they didn't completely neglect what's going on in India, there was a good chance that Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan in the Second Anglo-Mysore War could have made a much bigger headway, and then this would have limited the English. But that never happens, and because that never happens, the English managed to consolidate their rule in India. And after being kicked out of the Americas, the English redouble and focus their attention more on India. So with their attention focused more on India, Mysore basically uh, is without hope. They're going to be unable to, restore their fortunes. And in the fourth Anglo-Mysore War, uh, Mysore is finally completely destroyed by, or Tipu Sultan's Mysore is completely destroyed by the British East India Company, and Mysore, just like Hyderabad, must now become a protectorate of the East India Company. So when Mysore's king, Hindu king, is restored, and both Mysore and Hyderabad become protectorates of the East India Company, the EIC is now fully in charge of southern India. So uh, that's in 1799, after the destruction of Tipu Sultan's Mysore. Then in 1802, 3 years later, the East India Company conquers Delhi. So now they have control over the region from Bengal all the way to Delhi. So the East India Company now has control over South India and the northern part of India. And so only the middle part is missing. And there, in 1817, you have the Third Anglo-Maratha War, where the Deccan and basically central India falls under control of the East India Company. And with that, the British rule almost all of India. And while this is happening, uh, the East India Company is becoming more and more like a government. The British government back home is recognizing this, so they're beginning to revoke a lot of the privileges that the East India Company as a trading company used to have. So, like in 1813, the East India Company loses monopoly trading rights. In 1833, the East India Company loses the trading license itself, so they can no longer trade and becomes purely a administrative organization that still provides huge amounts of money back home to London, because they collect taxes in India, and then instead of spending that tax money in India, they ship it home to London so that the London shareholders can divvy that up as dividends. This East India Company rule ultimately is not going to last. I'm going to talk more about the East India Company rule in detail when we get to colonial India. But the sepoys mutiny, or you have what is called the Indian Rebellion, and the East India Company's rule over India comes to an end. All right. So this is Tipu Sultan, and this is the Kingdom of Mysore. That was at its maximum extent, and you can sort of see how that blue line shrinks to the red line. And then, that's the third Mysore War, and then, that green line is the new Kingdom of Mysore that's ruled by a Hindu king. So, what are we talking about when we talk about reforms? So, first and foremost, Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali realized that the Europeans have advanced technology. Uh, but it's not just the Europeans. They assume that people around the world must know more things than they do. People, they might know some things, but the other people around the world probably know other things too. So it's time to actually collect knowledge from all around the world. So they create a royal library to bring information from all over the world. And the two places they focus on is Persia and Europe. So notice how Persia is still seen as one of the major important centers, just like the Mughals. So it's like this is like the legacy or the carryover of the Mughal legacy, and Europe, because the French and the English are here in India. Uh, I also imagine that they're trying to get information from the Ottomans as well. But there's a royal library that basically has all this information, and this information allows them to start up. Whoa, start up new industry, such as things like the silk industry, the paper industry, the glass industry. And when they make glass, they can start making mirrors as well. And they even make clocks, right? So in southern India, in the kingdom of Mysore, there's this massive reform going on to try to transform the local Indian economy. Not only that, because they're fighting wars against their enemies, they have to have military reforms. So they also start to make an arms factory to make guns and cannons. And it is the Indians that invent the first rockets, right? The rockets that are used in war are invented by the Indians. So Mysorean rockets were these things, like a tube, and you light up in the back, and then it moves forward, and then it lands and explodes. But before it explodes, the tip has a sword attached to it. So the rocket starts to tumble as it falls down. And as it tumbles, it just lays carnage to a wide swath of area, and then it explodes. So it was a terrifying weapon. And the British were so impressed by the Mysorean rockets that uh, they actually used the rockets in the Napoleonic Wars and in the War of 1812. So the American national anthem, "Rockets Ablazing," the rockets ablazing that they're talking about is actually British rockets fired onto the American fort. And the song is basically saying that, oh my God, the British are firing rockets at our fort. And despite all that, the flag is still standing, right? The fort has not succumbed yet. So that's what the American national anthem is all about, but it's got this connection to Mysore, India, because the rockets are invented by the Indians and then it was adopted by the British. And of course, Tipu Sultan, more so than Hyder Ali, recognizes that the government needs to be more streamlined, and so instead of being the prime minister like Hyder Ali was, Tipu Sultan decides to usurp the throne himself and becomes the king and direct all these things. So, what happens to all this? Well, when the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War is over and the kingdom of Mysore is restored under a Hindu king, and Tipu Sultan is basically died in battle, uh, the British make sure to destroy the library. I think it'd be one thing if you just fight against your enemy and then you defeat them and you leave them as is and go, okay, we won. You know, it's that. But no, the British make sure to destroy the royal library so that the Indians can't actually do this reform themselves. And the king of Mysore, the Hindu king of Mysore, essentially is reduced to being a puppet. Well, not a puppet, but is a client king, just like the Nizam of Hyderabad is reduced to being a client king, because once they accept the protectorate status, what that means is the British East India Company is going to send a British resident, someone who lives there with the king at the royal court, and uh, this British resident has veto power. He doesn't use it often, but the British resident has veto power and won't let anything that is harmful to the interests of the East India Company to pass. Um, this relationship between the Indian kings and the British will continue even after the British East India Company is disbanded. So we're almost at the end here with the British East India Company, so let's now talk about them. The British East India Company was initially founded as a monopoly trading company. Uh, so if you are English or British, you can only buy things from India, Southeast Asia, and China, basically places in Asia, from the British East India Company. You cannot just get on your own boat, go to Asia, and do trade on your own. If you do that, you are breaking the law. The British East India Company is a monopoly trading company, and after they lose the competition to the Dutch East India Company in Southeast Asia, the British East India Company focuses all its attention on India. And by focusing all its attention on India, the goal is now to buy Indian calico and sell that calico in West Africa and Britain. That's the way the British East India Company is going to make money. Later on in the 1700s, the British East India Company is going to figure out that, hey, we can also buy Chinese tea and other Southeast Asian goods that the Dutch allow us to buy, and then sell that in Britain and make a huge amount of money. So the Boston Tea Party is famous in American education because American colonists dress up like Indians and dump tea into Boston Harbor. But that tea that's dumped into Boston Harbor is the property of the British East India Company and originally came from China. So world history really is connected, right? Um, so their goal is to make money. It's a monopoly trading company. And the board of directors in London is consistently writing letters to the people in India. Our goal is to make money. Stop fighting these damn wars. And the reason why they say that is because wars are freaking expensive. and the local commanders consistently ignore the command from London. And you can sort of see this in the growth of the army of the East India Company. Right? The East India Company army in 1796 is 13,000 British troops with 57,000 Indian sepoys, Indian mercenaries. Right? Sepoy is actually a corruption of the Persian word sipahi. So sipahi originally referred to cavalry, horsemen, but here it refers to mercenaries. Um, so my guess here is that somehow or another the Turkish word sipahi became sepoy. I don't know how, but it could be that the Turkish word sipahi has an analog in Persian, and so it got to India through Persian language, and then it got into English as sepoy. Anyway, but by the time you get the Sepoy Mutiny or the Indian Rebellion, British troops number 40,000, so it's tripled in number. But the Indian sepoys are now 311,000. They're like 6 times as many as they were before. So the East India Company has this vast army under its control. And so obviously the London Board of Directors is like, we don't want to pay for all these troops. Right? We just want to make money. So why does the East India Company in India continue to ignore what London says? And the answer is because the board of directors represent the stock owners. And the stock owners basically get income from the trade, sure. But what if you are a commander of a British troop in India, right, under the employ of the East India Company? You're not a stockholder. The trade isn't going to make you money. I mean, you're allowed to engage in the side business to some extent, but and by the side business, that means that when the ships go back and forth between India and Britain, you're allowed to send some cargo back and forth because you have to communicate with your family back home, and you can make some money that way because if you get some like Indian jewelry or something, and then you sell it in London, you make money. So, but you're not a stockholder, so you don't get money from dividends or anything like that. So, what's the easiest way to make money? If you're a commander of British forces of the East India Company forces in India, the easiest way to make money is to loot Indian cities and Indian towns. So local commanders get Indian mercenaries together, they attack purported enemy of the East India Company, and when they're defeated, you take over their city, and as that city falls under the control of the East India Company, the East India Company makes money, but also as a soldier, you get to loot for 3 days after the city has fallen, right? I mean, this is a standard practice that everybody has around the world. When a city falls, typically you got 3 days to go and loot the defeated city if the city didn't surrender, right? If the enemy city doesn't surrender and fights and the city falls, you have the right to loot. This was an ancient custom that people around the world basically all did. Looting was just something that people did all the time. And so if you know that that's the easiest way to make money, then if you're a commander, you're going to hire as many Indian troops as you can and use that to then conquer territory in India and then loot along the way. So huge fortunes are amassed, and the East India Company, if you're an East India Company officer, people made huge amounts of money through looting, and that was their ticket to becoming, a member of the upper class or the upper middle class back home in England. So, despite the fact that the board of directors in London consistently said, "Stop fighting these damn wars," it kept getting ignored. And because it kept getting ignored, that means the East India Company continues to expand. So, in the 1700s and 1800s, uh, the alliance with the Indian rulers, Indian kings, basically expands to 200 rulers. And by 1947, by the time the British India comes to an end, the East India Company and then later the British government has signed agreements with 565 princely states. 565 independent Indian kings who are now protectorates of Britain. So, famous ones are Hyderabad, Mysore, you know that. Jammu and Kashmir is another Indian kingdom that became a protectorate. Baroda and Gwalior, these are also protectorates. They were also ruled by Indian kings. Why? Why would you allow yourself to be a protectorate of Britain and accept a British resident who's got veto power so that you don't have control over foreign affairs? Right? And the answer is simple. As the East India Company is expanding, first things first, you don't want to lose. You don't want to be on the wrong side. So you might want to stick with the East India Company because they're winning all the time. So that might be one reason why you might do. Because if you lose, your territory is taken over, and you get nothing. So that's pretty bad, right? But there's another reason why. So as the East India Company territory expands, you realize that you're surrounded by either the East India Company territory or a former rival who's now also a protectorate of the East India Company. So as both of you are protectorates of the East India Company, you can't go to war against each other. So if you can't go to war against each other, then what's the point of having an independent foreign policy? It's kind of pointless. And if it's kind of pointless to have an independent foreign policy and you're surrounded by quote unquote friends, why keep an army? Right? And so the biggest expense of any country is usually its armed forces. And these Indian kings realized, hey, by being, a protector of the East India Company, I could just get rid of my army because I don't really need it. And so these princely states, one after the other, as they're surrounded by, quote unquote friendlies, they get rid of their armies. They become protectors of the East India Company and they get rid of their armies. And because they don't have an army to, keep afloat, all that money can now be spent on themselves and their families. So in a way, it's bribery. Right? You can lead, gorgeous lives because you're no longer paying the vast amounts of money required to keep up your army. And it is during this period, in the early modern period, that you have a proliferation of Indian palaces. So I didn't put it up on this video in this section, but I should have. But things like the Lake Palace is created under British rule because these Indian kings have all this money. And they have all this money because they don't have an army anymore. And they don't have an army anymore because they've accepted the status as a protectorate. So they can live lavish lifestyles. That's the other reason why you might want to accept being a protectorate. So there you go. All right, finally then, Mughals and British. Mughal ruled, a stable Mughal rule lasted from 1550s to 1707 for about 150 years, and stable British rule also lasted for about 150 years from 1802 to 1947. So there's a lot of similarities in these quote unquote foreign conquerors of India. So let's now go through them. Mughal rule was different from British rule because they really did believe in religion. Right? The Mughal aristocracy is 80% Muslim and 20% Hindu, while the Indian population was about 20% Muslim and 80% Hindu. But the Mughals believed too much in religion, so the policy of tolerance was the main thing that basically made or broke the Mughal Empire. And as long as the policy of tolerance was in place from from Akbar to his grandson, and then his great-grandson Aurangzeb overthrows it. But for 3 generations it was in place. That's the period when the Mughals could maintain a firm grip on India without worrying about the people not liking them. After Aurangzeb, not the same. In the British case, they didn't have this problem. The British Empire only cared about money. Right? The East India Company was initially only about trade, but as it became involved in Indian politics, because the French also got involved in Indian politics, the East India Company became a territorial governing entity. And because now that it's a territorial governing entity, it can't allow for hostile neighbors. And so what the British call in a fit of absent-mindedness, they gradually conquered it all, right? But because they conquered it all, but because their origin point is making money, religion is not a big issue for them. So they don't care, right? Christian proselytization, right? Christian missionaries from Britain do come to India, and the East India Company does say, yeah, well, if you want to proselytize the Indians, go ahead. We're not going to stop you. But there's no encouragement. The East India Company has no interest in actually encouraging the spread of Christianity. They don't care about that. They only care about money. And because they only care about money, the caste system is also pretty much left alone. They say things like, we want to get rid of the caste system, but they never do. And education is never worked upon. They don't really care about education. They only care about the small number of Indians that can read and write English that can serve the East India Company. So the East India Company will basically, help in creating universities. But the key of any education is getting the bulk of the population to be able to read and write. That's the key of education. And that's completely untouched. Every time they discuss doing primary school education in the East India Company, it gets shot down because it's way too expensive. And so the only thing the East India Company really did, in terms of culturally intervening in India, is the abolition of sati and the abolition of slavery. Sati is widow burning. So the Hindus had this terrible custom where if a husband died, then the surviving widow, whether she liked it or not, would be wrapped up in white cloth and then thrown on top of the funeral pyre of her husband. And so the widow would die with her husband. This is called sati, widow burning. And the British were horrified at this, and starting in 1829, they said, "That's it. We're putting an end to this." And wherever they controlled, they put an end to sati. Slavery, not that hard. They abolished this throughout the British Empire in 1833, and in India, it took time, but in 1843, it was also abolished as well. Right. So within this 10-year span from 1833 to 1843, slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire. Uh, so uh, that was it, right? And that sort of helped in maintaining control over India. But this monomaniacal interest in making money meant ignoring education, ignoring actively robbing India of its wealth. So once you get to the 20th century, when people actually start thinking in terms of nationalistic lines and start thinking not just in terms of religion, but also in terms of the well-being of the people, they're like, India used to be the wealthiest country, or one of the two wealthiest countries in the world, and now we're one of the poorest countries in the world. Right? What happened? What the British did nothing to actually stop this slide. In fact, they made the situation worse. And so that actually pushes for the independence movement and ultimately leads to the downfall of the British. So the Mughals cared too much about religion, the British cared too much about money. Okay? And that's because the British Empire was founded in a capitalist age. So that's why. All right, so that's it with India, and I will see you guys in the next video.